IDC International Radio, 106.2 FM, from Israel to the world.
You're listening to 106.2 FM IDC International Radio. This is Unpuzzling Terrorism. I'm Itai Hanman, and this is the show where we bring you MA students to come and interview experts on the subject of terrorism as we try to unravel the global phenomenon that is terrorism. The show is in collaboration with the ICT, the International Institute for Counterterrorism. On today's program, we have Dr. Eli Karmon, who is a senior research scholar at the Institute for Counterterrorism, a senior research fellow at the Institute for Policy and Strategy here at the IDC. He lectures in both the BA and MA program. Dr. Karmon, how are you doing today?
Good morning. Thank you very much.
And we also have the MA student with us today, Samantha Mandalese. How are you doing today?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. Dr. Karmon, we know you are an expert in a lot of regional conflicts that are going on right now in the Middle East here, and the one that is sticking out to everyone, as always, is what is happening in Syria. This civil war is not ending. It doesn't look like there is any end in sight, but there are a lot of players. You have states. You have those states being Iran, Russia, Israel, European nations. You have the United States all flying over and trying to create something inside, fighting different groups inside of Syria. And then you also have non-state actors, a lot of jihadi groups, some extremists, some are just moderate, if you will, by certain standards. And you also have rebel groups that are just anti-Assad forces, and of course Hezbollah and the Syrian regime working together. A report the other day came out that ISIS is moving up onto the Israeli border, and that an ISIS on Israeli border is something a little scary. You wrote a recent article about Jabhat al-Nusra and their name change and how they are going away from Al-Qaeda. I wanted to start the discussion and ask you, first and foremost, how difficult is it for Israel to contend with so many different jihadi groups on its northern border? And is there one in particular that they need to be afraid of or cooperate with?
Until lately, most of the groups that were active in southern Syria and on the border of the Golan Heights were mild Islamists, moderates, some of them supported by the West or by Jordan, and also Jabhat al-Nusra, which was very active operationally and was, in a sense, the avant-garde in the fights for conquering this part of the Syrian territory, but they did not attack Israeli targets, and they have no interest, actually, to attack Israel because they understand this could be counterproductive for them. They mostly fought the Assad regime and also, from time to time, the Hezbollah. What has changed lately is that Jabhat al-Nusra has concentrated mostly in the northern part of Syria, in the Aleppo and the Idlib region, where they have been successful, by the way, in the Idlib region. And some of the groups that were active in the south have somehow allied with ISIS, especially the Yarmouk Brigade and Jaish al-Islam. Inside these groups, by the way, there are factions. There is not so clear how these groups are acting because two factions of Jaish al-Islam are allied with ISIS. One is fighting ISIS. Indeed, they have advanced, especially after the fight for Palmyra. They retreated from there, but they have conquered some positions which can be considered close to the Golan Heights. But again, I don't think that they will attack Israel, especially now that they are under pressure in the north and east of Syria. They lost their contiguity with the Turkish border, and they are losing also a lot of territory in Iraq.
Dr. Karmon, when you look at all the different threats that are there right now, over the last couple weeks we saw, I would call them accidental mortar shells falling into Israel, but of course Israel responds, and rightfully so, direct strikes against Syrian army military installations. Do you think Israel has anything to fear from its northern border at the moment?
No, I think that these are incidents that we saw already for a year and a half or 2 years. The real threat was at the end of 2014, beginning of 2015, when Iran and Hezbollah tried to build a platform near the Golan Heights in order to threaten Israel because the Syrian army lost the control of this territory. And at that time, in January especially, 2015, Israel has acted very aggressively, assertively, has bombed some of the commanders of this avant-garde of the Iranians. One general was killed, Iranian general. Two of the main leaders of the Hezbollah in the region, Jihad Mughnieh and the famous Samir Kuntar, the Druze terrorist, which was liberated by Israel, they were killed. And for the moment, there is no such a threat. They understood, I think, the message that Israel will not permit the formation of such a base platform near its border.
So, Dr. Karmon, in your last answer, you mentioned that these jihadi groups that are are creating chaos in Syria, it's not so clear cut. There are factions within groups, and you mentioned that two factions of Jaish al-Islam, if I'm correct, are allied with ISIS, and one faction is fighting ISIS. So if there are differing factions within these groups that are whose goals seem to be diametrically opposed, how is it, what unites them into one jihadi organization? How is it that different factions that are fighting one another are still a part of Jaish al-Islam, if you catch my meaning? Does that make sense?
If you look to the map that some researchers have presented of the main groups that are active in Syria, you find at least 50, 60, 70 groups. But under these groups, in every village, every neighborhood in the big cities, you have small groups of fighters, several dozens or sometimes several hundreds of them, which one leader, it can be a head of the tribe, there can be some politician of the past, a new charismatic leader that take control, and he decides with whom to fight. I mean, if he receives money and weapons especially, in order to fight, he can decide, I will unite with Jabhat al-Nusra. By the way, Jabhat al-Nusra was very open to this kind of cooperation compared with ISIS, which preferred to kill these leaders and take control of the groups. And so you have some 900, 1,000 groups. So it's very difficult for any researcher or any intelligence service to decide exactly who will fight with whom. Even in the regime camp, not only you have the Hezbollah, you have the Iraqi Shias, Afghani Shia, Pakistani Shias fighting, and clearly the Islamic Revolutionary Guards of Iran fighting alongside the regime. But inside the regime occupied or controlled area, you have neighborhoods, you have villages where there is one leader, which was, by the way, trained by the Iranians or by Hezbollah or by the Syrian army. Mm-hmm. But many of them, by the way, are thugs. There is a lot of corruption. And there are 2 or 3 kind of militias of the ex or present air intelligence, okay? They control a militia. There is another military intelligence which is controlling another militia. Mm-hmm. So it's not clear who exactly is controlling what. The main fact is that they support Bashar al-Assad and the Alawi control.
I see. So you mentioned that in terms of contrasting between Daesh and Jabhat al-Nusra, for example, that Daesh prefers to exterminate the leaders of opposing groups, whereas Jabhat al-Nusra is a little bit more open to cooperation. So do you think that difference in strategy is born of religious convictions and ideology, or is it more a difference in strategy that's born of a utility and what works at the time? How do they make those sorts of decisions?
No, they can find some ideological or religious motivations, but actually this is tactics and strategy. And by the way, Jabhat al-Nusra received advice from the Al-Qaeda leadership, especially al-Zawahiri, and Al-Qaeda sent several of their senior fighters, old fighters, in order to help Jabhat al-Nusra organize. And they have decided that the best way to advance their goals is to cooperate with the local not only with the local militias, but also local population. They have developed what is called the Dawa infrastructure. ISIS has a state, okay, they have the caliphate. So they consider that they are have to control everybody. Either they kill, as I said, the leaders, and they take control, or they ask allegiance which must be respected, okay? So, again, they thought, until lately at least, that this is the best way. We see that they are beginning to lose, because the coalition is so, it's actually two coalitions, the Syrian army or Syrian regime, Iran and Russia, and Hezbollah and the other militias. And on the other hand, you have United States and the various Islamist, moderate, and jihadist groups, and Turkey, clearly, and the Gulf countries. So the Islamic State or the Caliphate is now squeezed between these two forces, and little by little is losing practically the control of its territory.
Which I think that's a very interesting point, especially with so Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's rhetoric is that this is a divinely inspired caliphate, and he's brought it back for the first time, and eventually this series of events will lead to the last 5,000 Muslims fighting the unbelievers for Judgment Day. The fact that Daesh is slowly losing control and losing territory, what does that do to sort of the belief in Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi's message? How will that change their rhetoric, and how will he adapt to those changing conditions in order to keep power?
I would like to stress one point. It is Baghdadi which is the caliph and the leader, but the backbone of the military structure are old Ba'athist or Saddamist officers, intelligence officers, and even administrators. I mean, people which were governors and so on. So the fact that they are losing, they are now clearly, they know that they are losing, and they began to disseminate messages that, look, even if we lose, actually we'll continue the fight. And this is, by the way, what they are trying to do in the West. They are the more they lose on the ground, they are trying to export the terrorism outside, especially in Western Europe and in Turkey, and perhaps also we see it, by the way, in Yemen and against the Saudis. So from their point of view, they say, even if we lose the territory, we'll prevail and will be victorious. And there is indeed two kind of alternatives for the future. If Mosul and Raqqa, the capitals of the caliphate, will fall, and they will disperse, because there are at least 25,000 foreign fighters. They will have to disperse, like after the war in Afghanistan, either to their own countries or to other countries where they can be refugees. And they can develop, indeed, a wave of terrorism, which is today only its beginning. I think there is another possibility. What we saw with radical leftist terrorist groups and some guerrilla groups in Europe and South America, which after the fall of the Soviet Union, they lost the ideological, if you want, motivation. They saw that although some of them were opposed to the Soviet Union, they considered them to be not sufficiently revolutionaries, but still this has practically stopped any advance of leftist radical groups in Germany, in Italy, in Peru, and even in Colombia we see now peace agreement. So there is a possibility that for a certain period of time there will be a wave of terror which is fueled by revenge, by desperation, if you want. But it is possible that it will stop after 2 or 3 years, if indeed the territory will be reoccupied by normal states, and if there will be a solution, because we don't see yet a solution for the Iraqi and Syrian situation. And what I see as a very difficult problem for all those which are involved, especially the great powers and the regional powers, what will happen with the Sunni population, the big Sunni population in Syria and in the Sunni triangle in Iraq, which for now they are under pressure by the Shia majority, by the Iranians and even the Americans. So how these two communities, huge communities, will find a solution, and this nobody can say. We see now that not only Turkey has entered the fray, they entered the territory of Syria. By the way, they already are in Iraq for almost a year and a half, in small quantities, and the great powers. With the entrance of the Russians in Syria and perhaps even in Iraq, this has transformed the conflict in a direct conflict almost between the two powers, although the United States, for the moment, is the weaker, if you want, player on the global arena, because they prefer not to intervene directly as the Russians did.
Right. Speaking of the Russians, Dr. Karmon, I wanted to ask you, a few months ago we heard Vladimir Putin express that they are winding down operations in Syria. And then we find out that they are stationing bombers to fly out of Iran, and they have stepped up their bombing campaign inside Syria. I wanted to ask you, what do you think will it take for the Russians to be even more involved in Syria and potentially put boots on the ground?
First of all, they have boots on the ground. They have not only the Air Force in 2 bases and air bases in northern Syria, and they have the old naval bases in Tartus, but also they have some, 2 or 3 commando battalions. And we know that some of these elite forces are involved in some of the battles in northern Syria. The Iranian, or the deployment of the long-range bombers in Iran, it's a very interesting development, because for the first time since the Second World War, Iran has accepted such kind of presence. And this is, by the way, opposed to the constitution, Article 146 of the Iranian constitution. And the Iranians saw it as a strategic, important step in their coalition with the Russians. But immediately the political sensitivities inside Iran and especially the fact that the Russians have boasted, look, we are now in Iran, we have, they did not take in consideration the sensitivities of the internal politics in Iran. And for this reason, actually they have retreated, and some Iranian leadership, including the Minister of Defense, which in a special declaration supported this deployment, 1 week later, or less than 1 week, said, criticized the Russians for their boasting, okay, and lack of gentlemen, if you want to. I saw this kind of Iranian behavior as a result of their weakness in Syria. Because if we look to what happened in Syria, in 2013, September 2013, there was a clear threat by President Obama to bomb Syrian military facilities after the chemical attack in the periphery of Damascus, which cost the life of 1,400 people, civilians. And the Iranians convinced Bashar al-Assad the best way to stop this kind of attack and survive practically is to accept the dismantling of the chemical infrastructure, huge chemical infrastructure, also under American and Russian umbrella. And it happened. And this saved, at that moment, the Bashar regime. A year ago, in August, even before June 2015, the Jabhat al-Nusra, with other groups, Ahrar al-Sham, and smaller groups, they occupy the province of Idlib and the city of Idlib, which is threatening directly the heartland of the Alawi community and the Latakia and Tartus harbors. At that moment, the Iranians were directly involved. Qasem Soleimani, the head of the Al-Quds force of the Islamic Republican Guards of Iran, was involved in the negotiations to bring the Russians inside. And this is exactly what happened. The Russians came and they changed the dawn on the ground. And this permitted the regime, with Iranian and Hezbollah support, to retake control of most of the periphery of Aleppo and cut the route between Turkey and Aleppo rebels. But after 2-3 weeks of such successes, all of a sudden, Jabhat al-Nusra, other groups, and even ISIS retook control of some and opened a small corridor from Aleppo to Turkey. And I think the Iranians understood again that their support with Hezbollah, with the Iraqi and Afghani militias, is not sufficient to stop the advance of the rebels. And I think that's the reason why they accepted that the Russians use this basis. But it happened that this was too much for some of the more radical, if you want, or more nationalist leader of the Islamic Republic.
Do you think that the Russians could be dragged into a situation like when they were in Afghanistan in the 1980s, or like the Americans were in Iraq over the last decade, where they are, with for all intents and purposes, full army war inside one of these countries? Do you think that Russia will enter the war in that capacity?
No, I don't think so, because they understand this is a huge gambling. I think that one of the reasons that they entered Syria was a kind of quid pro quo for the Ukrainian situation, because the West, Europe and the United States had decided on very severe sanctions and also political pressure on Russia. And that's that they, at the beginning, I think, saw this possibility to balance what happens in the Ukrainian conflict. But they saw that it's okay. The United States is not really stopping them. On the contrary, sometimes you have the impression that the United States establishment, especially Kerry, the head of the State Department, are quite glad with what the Russians did. But now they see this also, indeed, as a new penetration in all over the Middle East, because of the alliance with the Iranians and the possibility even to act in Iraq. Although there is an American presence in Iraq, there is a common headquarter, operational room of Russia, Iran, and the Iraqi regime in Baghdad. And there is a possibility they will be intervening also there. So from the Russian point of view, this is sufficient. They don't need to bring an army. And if you look to the greater map of the surroundings territory of Russia, you see that what they control is failed territories and states. It is in Donetsk region in Ukraine. They took only Crimea and the Donetsk region. In Moldova, they control Transnistria. In Caucasus, they control North Ossetia and Abkhazia. So I think the presence in Alawistan, what is the Alawi territory in Syria, is the same kind of presence. They have a small, very aggressive presence, and especially aerial one, and for them it's sufficient.
I wanted to ask you, we've talked a lot about the different factions, the different states, the different non-state actors, terrorist organizations, but we haven't yet talked about the Kurds. The Kurds have a tenuous relationship at the moment with the United States. They are worried that the United States will eventually betray them. But I'm interested in what the relationship between the Kurds and Israel is like. Is Israel supporting the Kurds in their bid for an independent Kurdistan? Is Israel arming or training them? How does that relationship look?
The Kurds are really the surprise of the last 5 years, what happens in the Middle East. But we must differentiate between the various causes. Mm-hmm. First of all, the Kurds in the autonomous region in Iraq. They are almost independent, and they indeed would like to declare independence. And by the way, the United States until lately was completely opposed to independence of the Kurds in Iraq. You have the Kurds in northern Syria, which were attacked especially by ISIS. Since the fight for the city of Kobane, which was a symbol, and the United States decided to support the Kurds have appeared as the real force, the Kurds in Syria, but also the Peshmerga in Iraq, that are fighting efficiently ISIS. And there are even the Kurds in Iran, by the way, which there is a region of Kurdistan, Iran, which they have some kind of low-level guerrilla against the regime in Tehran. The biggest Kurdish community is in Turkey. And until 2 years ago, there was even a negotiation between the President Erdogan and the Kurds, the leadership of the Kurds in Turkey, to some kind of arrangement. I always considered that Erdogan used these negotiations for internal reasons, trying to achieve the presidency, the kind of change in the constitution that will permit him to be an absolute president. He didn't accede to it, and he decided then to return to fight the Kurds. And not only he fights the Kurds, which return to guerrilla fight inside Turkey, but also the Kurds in Syria, because the Kurds in Syria, with support of the United States, but by the way, in the West, we support from Russia. The Russians have also a long-term relationship with the Kurds, and there they supported with bombardments. The Kurds, they would like to have a, they say autonomous, perhaps independent mini-state with some possibility of going to the Mediterranean Sea. From the Turkish point of view, this is seen as a very important strategic danger, not only because the Kurds are in southern Turkey, but because this influences what happens inside Turkey with the PKK, which is actually the ideological mentor of the Kurds, or the most forces of the Kurds in Syria.
Dr. Karmon, you also speak about, and you mentioned earlier, about how the awakening of Europe and how the foreign fighters are going to need somewhere to go, be it their home countries or other places where they can export some of their terrorism, be it for revenge, be it for just plain ideological reasons. The interesting part is that Europe over the last little while has seen an uptick in attacks. We've seen what happened in France. We've seen what happens in Belgium. We've seen it across the EU over the last few years, specifically the past year. As ISIS is being attacked and pushed into a corner, you mentioned that they might lash out with attacks outside of the Middle East. How dangerous is it for Europeans now, in the sense of, do they need to fear terrorist attacks on a daily basis, first of all? And second of all, are the European states ready to confront the actual extremism that's coming their way?
What happened is that this time, compared to what happened in Chechnya war, in Afghanistan war, the second Afghanistan war, many Europeans decided, European Muslims and converts, in some countries, more than 20% of the fighters which went to Syria and Iraq are converts. Europeans which converted recently to Islam, including women, by the way. And the numbers that we know about speak about 5, 6, perhaps even more thousands of Europeans. 30% at least have already returned. They have trained and fought in Syria, some of them in Iraq. They have been motivated, okay? And the result was the wave of attacks that we saw, especially in Belgium and France, but also in Germany, also in Copenhagen, and attempts in other parts of Europe. So no doubt, as I explained, the fact that the territory of the Caliphate will practically be under control of the alliance, different countries which will destroy this entity after the demise of their military force. More of them will return, perhaps 90%. They, on the one hand, will be prepared operationally because they were trained and fought in difficult urban conditions, and they possibly will try to take revenge. They will be desperate for some solution for their small groups and so on. And there is a danger, indeed, for a more serious wave of terrorism. On the other hand, the authorities did not take the necessary measures, although clearly the police and the intelligence services were very aware of the fact that hundreds of people were leaving for this fight. And for instance, if we take in consideration what happened in Nice, in France, with the truck, the guy which was responsible for this awful attack was not in Syria, but from the city of Nice, 110 fighters at least left for Syria and Iraq. Wow. Just today, I read an article about a small city near Paris called Trappes in the Yvelines province. 30,000 inhabitants, 60% of them are Muslims or various origins. The establishment is controlled by Islamists, and 50 people from this small country have left for fighting near Paris. You see. So again, the possibility that these people will be involved in terrorist activity is very high, and the authorities, they took them 2-3 years to respond to the threat. Only after the big attacks in Charlie Hebdo in Paris, the authorities decided to recruit 2,800 policemen, security personnel. They changed some part of the constitution. After the November 2015 attack, there is a kind of état de siège. It's a curfew, not curfew, but a special situation juridically. The army is on the streets. The same in Belgium. Only after the March airport attacks, they decided to recruit 600 people. This will take time because it's not from one day to another that these people will be professionals. It will take 2-3 years at least. In France, they decided, by the way, to build a kind of civil guard. Perhaps on the example of the what is in Israel, a very important force, which, by the way, also what is called Mishmar Ezrahi in Israel, the civil guard, under the control of the police, was formed in 1974 as a result of the big attack in the city of Maalot in the northern Israel, where 25 pupils, children, were killed, assassinated. So you see there is a reaction. Unfortunately, it's a bit slow and it will take time, but I think there will be no way to challenge this threat without such kind of measures, including measures which possibly are hurting the human rights or the liberty of speech and so on.
Dr. Karmon, what's interesting to me is sort of rhetoric that comes out of Europe in the last few years and how that's differed from rhetoric that has come out of Europe previously. There's traditionally been a lot of criticism of Israeli counterterrorism measures, whether it comes from European governments or European-funded NGOs or European press. And I'm curious, do you think that sort of the current wave of lone wolf terrorism in Europe perhaps will change the rhetoric coming out of Europe in regards to Israel? Or do you think the same criticism of Israeli counterterrorism measures will remain from Europe?
On the professional level, if you want, the authorities, and I speak about police, security service, intelligence services, even ministers of justice, they come to Israel to learn. Clearly, they understand that Israel has a unfortunately long, painful experience with terrorism. On the political level, there is also a change. unfortunately, sometimes it is a result of the strengthening of far-right parties in Europe, which is a result of this kind of Islamist wave and the fear that Muslims will change the, if you want, the democratic and European values of the continent. There will be always, I think, some parties or movements in the left or in the right which will not accept the Israeli methods of the fight against terrorism. But clearly, this can improve the image of Israel. I think Israel should be also quite modest, because our situation is sui generis. Okay, we have a small country. All our neighbors are enemies. We have closed almost all the borders, and we have a big minority, Arab minority on the one hand, and territories in West Bank and also the autonomous territory in Gaza. But I think we have a possibility to provide some advice, some example. For instance, the resilience of the Israeli society is also very important in this field, and I think that the mood versus Israel in Europe will change for the better, unfortunately, as a result also of terrorism.
We're sorry, but we are running out of time for the program for today, so we're going to end off with one last question for you. We know you are an expert in Hezbollah, and they've been fighting in Syria for quite some time. We feel, at least a society feels here in Israel, that since the Lebanon war in 2006, we've had a quiet front on the northern border with Lebanon, that maybe Israeli deterrence during that war had actually worked against Hezbollah. The question is now, though, that Hezbollah has been fighting inside of Syria for almost 5 years now. And being in there, they are, yes, losing manpower. Yes, they are losing equipment and infrastructure, etc. But at the same time, they are gaining much needed experience that could be translated into a deeper conflict with Israel in the long run. Do you think that Israel needs to take some sort of preemptive measure against Hezbollah, and now that they are so widely spread out throughout Syria plus southern Lebanon, they are not as well organized to potentially take on Israel? Does Israel have a responsibility to its country to preemptively attack Hezbollah, knowing that it might not be tomorrow or a year or even in 2 years from now, but another war with Hezbollah is eventual?
I'm one of those few ones, perhaps, that don't think that we really deterred Hezbollah. I think that the huge missile arsenal of Hezbollah and also the training of a quite important elite force, ground force, was the response of Iran to the threat to their nuclear facilities. Because they don't have, at least until lately, they didn't have any air force to attack us. They had several hundreds of long-range missiles, but we have anti-missile response, okay? So Hezbollah was indeed the missile force and the ground force that can threaten Israel. Now, as the facilities in Iran were not threatened really, as there is now an agreement, and clearly with the West and the United States, Israel will not attack these facilities for the foreseeable future, and especially because Iran is so much involved in Syria, not only to defend the Syrian regime, but because its own survival, it depends on the survival of the Bashar regime. Hezbollah has no interest. On the contrary, if they will act against Israel forcefully, even if there will be an incident, serious incident, which will lose control, the two sides will lose control, they are in a bad position. So it is true that they are learning a lot in Syria. They are achieving perhaps even weapons, more advanced weapons from the Iranians, but also from the Syrians, who receive them from the Russians, although the Russians do not know that the Syrians give to the Hezbollah. So they represent a threat, again, and in my opinion, the main strategic threat to Israel, because they have the possibility to, first of all, to threaten with their missiles all Israeli territory. You cannot defend with all our anti-missile system what they have as an arsenal, and they can even try to take control of some of the villages in northern Israel if they decide to do it for several days and so on. So I don't think that for the near future there is a threat that the Hezbollah will do something. I think Israel will not try to make a preventive war as long as the situation continues to be the same. And I would like to point to a serious change in the strategic situation in Lebanon, because in Lebanon you have now 1.5 million Sunni refugees, Syrian Sunni refugees, which means that if they stay there 1 million and they for the moment don't have where to return, for clear, no house, no infrastructure, and clearly there is still a war. So the demographic situation in Lebanon is much more difficult for the Hezbollah and the Shias in general, which were the biggest minority. All of a sudden, perhaps they are much more smaller. For the moment, I mean, they could lose control of what they have now in Lebanon.
Dr. Karmon, thank you so much for joining us. For anyone that joined us late, Dr. Karmon is a senior research scholar at the International Institute for Counterterrorism, a senior research fellow at the Institute for Policy and Strategy here at the IDC. He is a lecturer as well in the MA program. Samantha, a master's student here at the IDC. Thank you both for joining us. It has been truly a pleasure to hear your answers and get enlightened on a situation that is ever so complicated and continues to become even more complicated with no end in sight, actually, at this time. So thank you to you both for joining us here on Unpuzzling Terrorism on 106.2 FM.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much.
For the very relevant questions.
Thank you very much for joining us.
My
we
pleasure.
really appreciate it.
IDC International Radio, 106.2 FM, from Israel to the world.